on LGBTQ marketing and research. So the company really started tourism focused. You'll see that about a third of our clients are in tourism and hospitality, but about a third of our clients are in finance. A third of our clients are kind of across every other industry, from Target and AT&T and UPS and Google, to Hallmark Cards and the WNBA. We work with a lot of nonprofit organizations like AARP and the American Cancer Society and Planned Parenthood and Human Rights Campaign Foundation. We work with government institutions. We did a large study for the US Census talking about terminology. Obviously, if you want to get good results from the census, you have to ask the right questions. And a lot of asking the right questions is how the community refers to itself. And we've done work for a lot of universities as well, sometimes just recruiting for their own studies. So the company started off tourism focused. It started off really marketing focused. And then over time, it really became much more market research focused because our clients were asking us, who are these people? What makes them tick? What are they buying? What are their motivations? What are their occasions for purchasing a product? How does my brand, like Wells Fargo, stack up to the other banks? So that was all driven really by the market. In marketing, there's a saying, I call it my marketing 101. And that is, if you want to know what to sell and you want to know how to sell it, ask your customer. So that's not rocket science, right? But you'd be surprised how many companies come to market with a bad product idea, throw it out there, advertise the heck out of it, and it fails. And that's market research, but it's a really expensive way of doing market research. The better approach is to gather the data, do focus groups, test your product, test your advertising, test your imagery, test your messaging, and then roll it out into the market, and then test again and see where you might improve. So that's why I'm a big proponent of market research. I love market research. I was getting my hair cut today, and at the barber, the stylist asked me what I do, and I told her, and she said, that sounds fantastic. What an interesting career. And I said, you know, I've been doing this almost 30 years, and every day it's interesting. I learned so much from all the market research that we do. And I would also like to hand it soon over to David Paisley, who has crafted about 300 market research studies for our clients on the LGBTQ community. He's really what I call the chief architect of our surveys and our focus group studies. He is probably the most, I mean, maybe I'm the face of the company because I started it and I'm the president, but David really knows more about the LGBTQ community than probably anybody based on doing all these studies. So next slide, Dave. I want to encourage you to dig into some of our research. This is all free. A lot of companies charge for these kinds of studies. We don't. We want to raise everybody's boat. What I mean by that is by putting these studies out there, clients and non-clients can improve their results with the LGBTQ community. And that benefits everybody, right? So if they're doing the right thing and they're out there providing good products and services to our community, giving back to our community, supporting our community, that benefits everybody. And some of them come in along and become a client, and of course we welcome that. But these studies are available for free. So the LGBTQ community survey, which we're going to be presenting to you in about 2 or 3 minutes. I also encourage you to read the Black LGBTQ community survey, because the intersectionality of race and ethnicity with LGBTQ can't be overlooked. It's super important. We aren't just LGBTQ people. We are also a race and ethnicity, a gender identity. We are a different kind of family. Maybe we're married, maybe we have kids, maybe we're younger, maybe we're older. All of that has an influence on how we purchase. So it's not just LGBTQ that we look at. We look at the entire matrix or spectrum of the LGBTQ community. And because we have a lot of travel clients, we've done 3 studies on LGBTQ community and travel. There's a consumer product study, a health study, auto ownership, and lots more. So if you're interested in any of these fields, or even just interested in exploring one of the segments of market research, take a look. I think you'll really enjoy it. Next slide, Dave.
Sorry.
So I'm going to turn it over to Dave now to talk to you about how we put our studies together, because it's super important. The methodology behind a study is really where you need to start. If you're looking at data, find out how many people they surveyed, how they got those people, are they representative of the entire community? Often we look at LGBTQ research and we're just astonished to see a company call a study LGBTQ when, sadly, when you look at the results of it, it's largely one segment of LGBTQ, either male or female, younger or older, and they call it LGBTQ, and it really doesn't represent the entire community. So the methodology is the most important thing to look at when you're taking a look at market research. So take it away, Dave. I might chime in a little bit here and there, but you're the master.
Okay, and also you just check in. How long do you? When's the end time for this?
So I would shoot to wrap up by maybe 7:15 and leave some time for questions, and we'll
right.
wrap up by 7:30.
All right, very good.
We'll go through pretty quickly, but we'll give you a copy of this so everybody can dig in deeper.
All right, so the first thing I want to say is that we actually use 2 different types of methodologies. We have our own research panel of about 50,000 LGBTQ community members, and that's really nice. It's a really broad, diverse panel. We've built that panel over about 20 or 30 years, and we use that for primarily our research that we're doing for clients. But there's a secondary methodology that we use for this community survey, and I think it's a really important distinction, is that the community survey has a very large group of people that come into it, about 15,000 LGBTQ people. But these are people who are actually coming in more through our community partners. And every year we'll have 100 to 200 LGBTQ partners who are either media or events or organizations in our community, and they feed people into the survey. So the reason that this particular survey is important is that I would acknowledge that this survey does have some limitations as far as its demographics. But the most important thing is that if you're doing an outreach campaign to the LGBTQ community, this type of research that here, and we call it the community survey, is because it really represents who will be seeing your ads or your outreach efforts, because they represent the types of media and organizations you're actually sponsoring or advertising. So anyway, this survey has about 15,000 people. I want to go into the results more than the methodology because I have way too many slides, but this represents about 15,000 people. And what I also want to say is that because it's coming from LGBT community organizations and media, these are people who are part of the community. They feel pride at being a community member. They read our media. They support our organizations. So I think what this slide is important is to say is that understand that when you're advertising in the LGBTQ media, you're advertising it to a part of the community that is active and representative within the community. So I throw that out there too. All right, so a little bit about impact of outreach in the LGBTQ community. So the thing I want to say here is that when you're advertising to LGBTQ people, you're not advertising to my sexual orientation. You know, yes, I am a gay man. I would argue that gay man and lesbian is actually not a sexual orientation, it's a cultural identity. I'm really a homosexual. And when you're outreaching to me, you're not outreaching to me as a homosexual man. You're outreaching to me as a gay man, and that has a cultural context. And when you look at the LGBT community, you know, we have our own, you know, we have our heroes, we have our villains, we have our celebrations and joys, and we also have our tragedies, right? And all that is what makes up a community as a whole. People often ask, how big is the LGBT community? And it's really hard, you know, as that alphabet expands, L, G, B, and T, and then the Q, and then the plus, our community becomes bigger. So it was long thought, you know, a long time ago, it was said that like 1 out of 10 people were gay or lesbian, right? That's probably too high, quite frankly. If I look back 10 years ago or 15 years ago, a lot of the statistics came in about 5%, were 5% of the overall adult population was LGBTQ. But things are changing a little bit. As the alphabet expands and our community expands, those percentages are going up. And you may have seen that the census last week did some of its first research where it's actually specifically asking questions around gender identity and sexual orientation. And they came in about 8% of the US adult population was LGBTQ. So the community is actually expanding a little bit over time. I also want to say, as I said before, that when you're promoting to the community, you're not really promoting to me as a sexual orientation or gender identity. You're promoting to me as a cultural identity. And our culture is partially defined by discrimination, that we have a long history of being discriminated against in various ways. It's changing a little bit. It has gotten a lot better for gay men and lesbians over time, but the discrimination level for transgender and non-binary people is really, really high right now, right? So discrimination defines our culture a little bit, right? So because of that, you get statistics like this. You know, we asked in the community survey, LGBTQ supportive companies have made a positive difference for their employees. You know, 70% agree, almost no disagree, and a bunch are neutral. You know, I think more positively about companies that advertise in LGBTQ media. Again, a large degree, very few disagree. I regularly read or view the LGBTQ media. Part of a culture is having a media, a communication vehicles, be it print or digital or social media. And we have that and we interact with our media. We're more likely to purchase from companies that outreach and advertise to our community. Again, 74% agree and only 4% disagree. And they think more positively about companies that sponsor our organizations. Again, really strong agreement. So the reason I bring that up is that sort of the cornerstone, I think, of LGBTQ marketing is that we respond to corporations that support our community. We always have. And sometimes we boycott corporations that aren't supportive of our community or against our community. And both of those things really do happen. And also we feel connected to our LGBTQ political organizations and social organizations. So another thing about LGBTQ is that there's just tons and tons of political and social and event organizations out there that support us. Now this one I think is more interesting. Corporate presence at LGBT pride events are positive for the community. And although this is really very positive, still at 58%, you may have noticed, if I go backwards, the number dropped like about 15%. And there's been a little bit of backlash recently about corporate involvement in Pride and making Pride, which was traditionally or started as a protest march, too much of a sort of like a corporate festival. And some people in our community feel that we've sort of maybe lost touch with the roots of Pride a little bit. So interestingly, lately there's been a little bit of a backlash about the sort of pink washing of the LGBT community by corporate America. And a lot of that is really geared towards Pride. So one thing that you'll hear over and over again is that for a corporation to be successful in our community, you need to be authentically supporting our community. The way you authentically support our community is to sponsor and be involved with our organizations and events out there. And if you can't prove that corporate support for the community, at this point, I would almost say don't get involved. The first step is to prove that you are actually involved and supportive of our community. And then after you develop your reputation after a couple of years, at that point you start advertising. If you go right into an advertising campaign with no sort of reputation, it's actually going to maybe backlash a little bit on the corporation. And we've seen that over and over again. That wasn't necessarily true 15 or 20 years ago. I think the community was just sort of grateful that any corporation would be spending money and being in our media and sponsoring events. But today, it's a little bit different. You actually need to sort of prove that you are supportive of the community. Otherwise, there can be a backlash against your corporation. All right, so a little bit about LGBTQ demographics. Our demographics are actually different than the general population, and that has both positive and negative side effects. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but I first want to show you sort of a positive and negative example of how our differences in our demographics affect a couple things. So what I always say out there is that we don't necessarily, there's a reputation that somehow the LGBT community is these great consumers and we outperform on every product and service. And that's just not true. We do outperform on certain products and services. I think a great example is travel. We do tend to outperform as being travelers, but there are other kinds of products that we actually underrepresent as far as purchasing, and a lot of it has to do with our demographics. So the first thing I'm going to do is a positive. You may or may not know this, but we are in the community really leading with COVID vaccination rates. Right now, we're about 90% vaccinated within our adult community. So why is that? That has a little bit to do with the demographics. We're more likely to be liberal. We're more likely to live in urban areas. We're more likely to live in blue states. The LGBT community traditionally has a really high education rate. We may have more experience with medical science in many ways through both education and also through things like HIV. And also we are more likely to experience COVID-19 related isolation. So why is that? Well, we have a higher percentage of we have a higher percentage of our population that is single and are living with roommates and not having kids. So when COVID happens, we sort of got trapped in our little apartments in ways that maybe the general population didn't. So in order to break free for that and to decrease our COVID-related isolation, we needed to get vaccinated and rejoin our community. And that's another reason why our vaccination rates were really high. So those demographics, when it comes to vaccination, lead to a good, not exactly consumer, but a good consumer response. But here's an example where it works against us. Homeownership. The LGBTQ community is far less likely to own their home than the general population. Only about half of the LGBTQ community owns their home compared to 64% of the general population. So that's a big decrease. So why is that? Well, there are 3 indicators to homeownership that are really important. People who are married are more likely to own their home, and we underrepresent there. People who have children are more likely to own their home, and we underrepresent there. And this is some things that sometimes people don't realize, but there's a statistic out there which I always love, is that people who live within 50 miles of mom are more likely to own their home. And we as a community are extremely mobile, and we tend not to live within 50 miles of home. We tend to be bouncing around the country a little bit is where we live. And all those lead to less likely to be homeownership. So the demographics then, for this consumer product, work against us. All right. So let me talk about demographics a little bit more. First of all, being single. I think one thing you always need to keep in mind within our community is that relationship rates are different by gender and gender identity. So at any given moment, lesbian and bi plus women are more likely to be in a relationship and be married than gay and bisexual men. There's a big difference there. The transgender and non-binary community tends to be a little bit more in between the statistics. But there are a lot of single gay men out there, and that matters. And that's one of the reasons that the alcohol industry is really all over gay and bisexual men. It's a really great product for single people. And you'll find traditionally that vodka and beer, mainly vodka and beer, have really heavily spent a lot of money in the gay men's community, partially because of our relationship status statistics. Another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about relationships is just talking a little bit about relationships in the non-binary. This is something we're talking a little bit more about these days at CMI, is that sometimes we think about the community as being in same-sex or opposite-sex relationships, but that's not true for everyone. There are other terms. There are people who are non-binary or transgender couples or queer couples or poly relationships. And although the majority of our community is probably in same-sex or opposite-sex couples, I think you just need to be careful about your language here, because within our community, there are many different types of relationships, and same-sex and opposite-sex maybe doesn't apply to everyone. I think parents is another really interesting thing, is that although we do tend to underrepresent being parents in the general population, that's particularly stronger for the cisgender gay and bi plus men. So when we look at cisgender, lesbian, and bi plus women, there are a lot more families and parents there than the men. And that matters from a consumer marketing standpoint. And one thing I find really interesting here is that early on, the reputation is that corporate America advertises to gay men, and ignores the lesbian community and ignores the transgender and non-binary community. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's still true today. It was much more true 20 years ago, where I would say corporations exclusively outreach to gay men. But one thing that we really saw here is that in the early days of family marketing to the LGBTQ community, they would do these ads with 2 gay men with kids, and the women revolted. Women were just like, if there's one thing that we do really well is have children and have families, and you're still ignoring us, right? And there was a real anger when that all happened. So I think if you're doing like the LGBTQ family market, you need to lead with both with cisgender, lesbian, bi plus women, and even the transgender and non-binary community has higher percentages of parents than the men. That's not to say that gay and bisexual men don't have kids and there aren't families. I'm just saying that statistics are a little bit lopsided. There's also this grandparent market that nobody really talks about. It's funny, we don't do a lot of research about LGBTQ grandparents, but we do some, like we've done some for Disney and some cruise lines. There are grandparents out there, and there's this dynamic that when you look at baby boomers, it was really hard to be out as a baby boomer, 40 years ago. And a lot of the baby boomers were in opposite sex relationship and were married and had kids and came out later in life. But now there's a lot of grandparents, right? And a lot of grandchildren within the LGBTQ community, within those older populations. So the LGBTQ grandparent market is a viable market. And there are some industries, particularly within travel, that are actually looking at that. A little thing about LGBTQ versus non-LGBTQ friends. I think this is interesting. This is the first time we asked this question. And we always made this assumption that young people, age 18 to 34, had a lot more, I'm going to say, straight friends than LGBTQ friends, and that older people had a lot more gay friends than straight friends. That's sort of the stereotype. And we don't see it, actually. I mean, the numbers are a little bit different, but they're actually following pretty much the same trends by age and pretty much the same trends by gender and gender identity, too. Is that within my community, there's a big mix. I have gay friends, I have straight friends, and it's pretty well evenly distributed across those graphs. And it's pretty well evenly distributed across the board. So I'm not sure I believe in that myth anymore, that young people are any different than old people in the level of LGBTQ friends that they have. All right, a little bit about living in friendly communities. One of the other big myths out there is that LGBTQ people only live in big cities. And it's true, we do overrepresent in big cities, particularly gay men. But it's also true that the vast majority of us do not live in big cities. So this becomes really important when we talk about like policies and non-discrimination policies, because a lot of big cities have really great non-discrimination policies for sexual orientation and gender identity, but a lot of states out there don't. And if you look at some of these red states, like say Texas or Florida, a lot of the big cities within those states are really LGBTQ friendly, but the states aren't, and the protections aren't statewide. And that's really important because most of us don't live in those big cities. Most of us live in a lot of different areas. And particularly lesbian and bi plus women and transgender and non-binary people are much more spread out across many different kinds of community types. So we really are living in everywhere. I'm actually calling, I live in rural America. I'm calling in from Joshua Tree, California. But that's where I live. I live in a town of 7,500 people. Also, when you look at LGBT-friendly environments, I think there's self-selection to some degree. Like, not everyone lives in an LGBTQ place or city or state, but there is self-selection that LGBTQ people tend to move to places that are a little bit more friendly. But I think what's interesting here is the question is that I live in an LGBTQ-friendly country. So in the United States, of our USA residents, only 56% feel they live in an LGBTQ-friendly country. But compare that to Canada, 96% of Canadian LGBTQ people feel that their country is very friendly to them. So that's a huge gap in difference, right? We also have some state statistics under there, and not surprising, California was number one at 99%. And of the big states, Texas was 22% of people who live in those states and felt that their state was an LGBTQ-friendly place. And also not surprising, size of community matters. That people that live in big cities, for the most part, think they're in a very LGBTQ-friendly place, but you start going down to rural America and it gets much lower. And we asked the same thing with transgender. Not surprising that there's a difference between the concept of an LGBTQ-friendly environment and a transgender and non-binary friendly community. And in general, in the United States, we live in a situation where there's a lot of discrimination against transgender and non-binary people, and it's being used as a wedge issue in a political football, and that is really important. And it's something that you really need to stand up against, and that matters, just not the transgender and non-binary people, but if you're a corporation or a municipality and you're really supporting transgender rights, the lesbians and gays and bisexuals notice that, and it really is a reputation building importance, and that's really important for corporate America right now. And a lot of corporations today are coming to us to really increase their ability to be LGBTQ, no, I'm sorry, to be more transgender and non-binary welcoming in their customer base, but also their employees. All right, a little bit about terminology within the LGBTQ community. You might ask about the alphabet, and you might see LGBTQ, LGBTQ+, just LGBT. We've actually been tracking this over the last 15 years as the alphabet changes. And as you remember, or you might not know, is that the alphabet started as GLBT. And for many, many years, we referred to ourselves as the GLBT community, and then the lesbians revolted, and that gets back to that time when people were saying, well, why is it always about gay men, gay men, gay men? And eventually it transitioned to be LGBT. There was a time that many corporations held on and continued to use GLBT, and at some point it just became embarrassing for them. It just looked like they were really old and backwards and not progressive if they held on to GLBT. The same thing's happening today at corporations who just use LGBT. We wouldn't recommend just using LGBT today because it's beginning to make you look a little non-progressive. You need to at least add the Q or add the Q+. So we've been asking this question for a long time, and this is just data from just a couple months ago. The following terms are used to describe our community. Please how you rate them when corporations and nonprofits and the media are using them. And we've been doing this for a long time. And as you can see this year, that LGBTQ, LGBT, and LGBTQ+ look to be about the same, all right? But that's not really what's happening in this graph and the tracking over time. The support for just using LGBT is starting to plummet. And that's why I say if you're a corporation today, if you're using just LGBT, stop it today. It is not what the future is. If you're still using LGBTQ, that's okay. It is the #1 rated thing, marginally, for now. But the real story of this year is that LGBTQ+ went up 9 points and now is basically tied. I'm sure, just knowing how this data has worked through the years, next year it will be LGBTQ+, will be the #1 rated term. We still, on this survey title, we used LGBTQ because it still is technically #1, but I'm sure next year it will be the LGBTQ+ market research report because it will be #1 next year because that's the way things go. Queer is a word that has its positives and negatives. I mean, if you look at the data on the next slide, we break it out by different demographics, as you can see on the bottom, is that queer still has some significant unfavorables within older populations. And it's very favorable for younger populations. So what I say to corporations is like, queer is a very familiar term. Like I can call Tom queer, he can call me queer. We're both in the community, that's fine. Right, but for a corporation to call me queer, that might be a little weird, unless you have such an amazing reputation with our community that you can get away with that. So I don't necessarily recommend that corporations use the word queer, but I think it's fine if you're a small business that's LGBTQ owned and operated, if you're a gay bar, if you're in the community, or if you have a stellar reputation, it can be fine. It also may be fine if your customer base is mostly young people. But if your customer base is mostly older people, I wouldn't use it right now because the negatives on queer with baby boomers or people over 55 are really quite strong, although they're getting better over time. If you looked at this chart like 4 years ago, the negative on queer was much higher than the positive, but now the positive and negative and neutral, it's about the same. So older people are slowly warming up to the word queer, but it's been a slow process. All right, and a few more slides and we'll open up for questions and answers. I want to talk about LGBTQ health just a little bit. LGBTQ health is interesting from a marketing perspective. Now, of course, you could be a pharmaceutical. We do a lot of work in the pharmaceutical industry, especially around HIV and PrEP. You might be a health insurer, and all of this sort of matters for health. But what I'm going to suggest is that health matters for every type of corporation because there's nothing more personal than health, right? How I feel about my body, how I feel about my health is really, really important to the very essence of who I am. and you can, and not to be sort of, not just be too flip about it, but you can sell me things based on my feelings about health. And you see that with corporations all the time. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the health concerns within the LGBTQ community. Now, in order to look at health, you have to look at both gender identity, and age, because, the health concerns, I know this is really complicated, but I'll make it a little bit simpler in a second. The health concerns for men are different than women, that are different than transgender people. The health concerns of an 18-year-old gay man is different than the health concerns of a 70-year-old gay man, right? So you have to look at health issues by gender and generation. So on this chart, it's way too complicated, so don't get too freaked out about it. But we do have in the report what's going on for cisgender gay and bi plus men, and also cisgender lesbian, bi plus women, and transgender and non-binary. I'm going to go back to the men and talk about a couple things. I'll flip over to the next issue. So depression, anxiety, and other mental health concerns is pretty well across the board with young person, the number one health concern within the LGBTQ community. When you get into older populations, some things like high blood pressure and diabetes and stuff starts to raise up because of their age. But for young people, depression, anxiety, and mental health concerns by far number one. So again, that's really important to know that things that are stress, and that's true for men, and it's particularly true for lesbian and bi plus women, and it's even more so true for transgender and non-binary participants. So that whole concept of stress and anxiety is really, really important to the LGBTQ community. So how's that work for marketing? Well, maybe you would sponsor something like the Trevor Project, which is the suicide prevention hotline and service within our community that works with youth. That's a good sponsorship that comes back and really looks at health issues. Same thing with gay men. You'll see with gay men that preventing and treating HIV is a really, really high issue for us. So again, sponsoring an HIV-related organization may be a good way of building reputation and credibility within the market if your primary market is gay men and bisexual men, right? Other issues here, the whole concept of body weight and getting to a healthy body weight across the board is really, really important to our community. It's even more so important within the women's market. And I'm actually running 2 studies right now for universities about this whole concept of body weight, body image issues, particularly with lesbian and bi plus women. So it's a big issue within that community. If you're looking at across the board, the whole concept of sleep is really, really big. So sleep issues and improving sleep is really, really big issues within the LGBTQ community, again, across the board, across all gender, across ages. So I throw that out there that I think health information is important because it's health information. It's important to health related industries, but it also can be important for other types of products and services, because by sponsoring the organizations that support these concerns within our community is a good way to get noticed, to make a difference, right? So there's a whole health report that we do. So if you're interested in LGBTQ health, you can certainly go and look at it much more specifically. And then I think this is the last slide. I just want to talk about COVID-19, and gets back to what I said earlier. We just asked, how has COVID-19 impacted you? And the number one ways was making me feel socially isolated. And I talked a little bit about that, and I think that's one of the reasons we have high vaccination rates. But mental health was the number 2 concern, right? So the mental health concerns around COVID-19 are far more important than like the financial employment concerns or rent or mortgage. They really went down. But it was the mental health concerns that really came up. And again, I think that's one of the reasons our vaccination rates got to be so high. All right, and I think this, in fact, is the last slide. You may or may not know this, but another great way to connect to the community is to really understand that we have a really great infrastructure of LGBTQ events. Now, of course, they've been a little bit delayed because of COVID, but it goes well beyond Pride. People think about our community as like Pride events in every city, and that's great. And that's a great event. But I think when you really want to connect with segments within LGBTQ, you need to realize that there are all these different segments that are available. So you have things like Black Prides are becoming more and more popular. There's tons of lesbian and women's events, tons of transgender community events, educational events and conferences. You have bear events for larger, hairier gay men. You have events for the Latinx community, you have outdoor enthusiast events, but there's just hundreds, if not thousands of events across America, which will come back eventually. And we found that being part of and sponsoring these events is a really great way to connect with the segment within the LGBT community that makes the most sense for your product and service. All right, so it's 7:12. I'll let Tom finish and then we'll open up for questions and answers.
So here's my email address. I encourage you and welcome you to send us any kind of follow-up questions. If you need some more information about any of the topics that we really briefly covered here, we could literally talk for days about the studies that we've done because we've been doing this for so long, for so many different organizations. But we're really here for you. We want to be a resource, help you out as much as needed, even if it's just advice on starting your own research company at some point, if that's of interest, or looking at a segment. You know, we talk about LGBTQ as a segment. The 101 is that it really applies across all segments. So if you're interested in starting an Asian American market research company, a lot of the same principles of how we built ours would apply to building yours. So, you know, feel free to connect with us. Next one, Dave.
Another thing also, Tom, I'll say about that is, Tom started this business. I came in very early on, but it's something we built when we were young, and we're not as young as we used to be. But I really do encourage you that for students here, when you graduate, you can really start a small company, and it's slow starting. Keep that in mind. You might not get a lot of money for the first 5 years, but if you stick with it and build with it, you can really build something really great for yourself and your employees. So it's a good way to go, and I think it's made me and Tom really. It's made my life really fulfilled to be able to do this kind of work for so many decades.
That's nice to hear, Dave. Thank you. We've been working together for about 28 years. I think we can complete each other's sentences after all these years, but he's right. So when you graduate, you'll have kind of two major categories of paths to take. One is get a job, and the other is to start your own job. Obviously, we went the start your own job route. I have no regrets. It hasn't been without stress, I should say. It's challenging, but it's exciting. You have your own world. But maybe you want to start off being an employee of another company for a few years and sort of get to know that company and that market approach, and then spin off. So anyway, if you need any of our advice, guidance, whatever, we're here for you. So we are opening to questions now. If you think of anything regarding the slides that we covered or our business or anything that we haven't covered, you're more than welcome to ask away.
Yeah, well, first, let me just say it's extremely gracious of you first to give your time tonight and give a really interesting presentation and to offer to talk to folks, for any reason. But boy, if any of you are kind of in an entrepreneurial mindset and are really thinking about how do you connect with a community, I can't think of anybody better to talk to than Tom and David. And you'll come across so many people in the market research world who are saying, oh, we're building a community, we're building a community. And really that just translates to, they put together a panel of people who've agreed to take surveys for money. But there's no real actual connection, no real actual conversation. If you really want to connect with a group of people, you have to understand how do they want to be spoken to? How do they want to be referred to? And so many of the lessons that Tom has learned would really benefit a lot of people. Let me just start with a quick question that I have.
Hey, can I just add just one thing to that? As
Sure.
I mentioned early, our business is really based on, we have a group of 50,000 LGBTQ community members that are part of our research panel. Some of them have been with us for 20 years, and I'm not saying they're family, that would be sort of ridiculous, but they are the base of our company, and we treat them really well and we communicate with them very well. So like currently today, we're working on a project around COVID-19 in the LGBT community for the HRC Foundation and also the Rockefeller Foundation. I probably communicated with 200-300 people with personal emails today. I spent my entire day on this panel, just going back and forth with the panel and talking about it. It's part of like what building a panel is. It's not just about a bunch of emails. It's about communicating with the panel. And I think that's something we've always done better than any research agency out there. And I think the way we can do it is because it's still relatively small and it's relatively community based, but that you got to build a community, and that's what we've done with our research panel.
Yeah, I think you have walked the walk in building community in a way that a lot of market research firms haven't. So kudos on that. So let me just quick ask my multi-parted question, and I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about kind of brands that have successfully connected with this community. You know, I know some of the first ones to really connect were travel companies and travel publications, and I'm sure that must have been a controversial decision within their own organization, how we did a lot of testing to get the imagery right and the messaging right. And so I'd be curious to hear about that, and then kind of brands today. So I know that in the past you've shared some data on what brands really resonate with the community, and so Target and Starbucks and Apple are ones that are like hugely successful companies that connect with this community very effectively. And remember, the other point that you've always made about that, Tom, which I've always found so interesting, is that the way that certain brands have connected with the community really had a huge impact on social change and, you know, acceptance of things like gay marriage. And we don't really think of companies as forces of social change like that, but this seems to be a really interesting example.
Absolutely. And so thanks for bringing that up. Yes, one of the questions that we ask every couple of years is, it's a write-in question. And the question is, which companies have made a positive impact on the LGBTQ community through their best practices, their outreach, their support, that you've actually made a purchase from that company because of that support? And year after year, for probably the past 10 years, it's been Target, #1, followed by Starbucks and some of the other companies that you mentioned. So you have a really good memory, Stephen. I appreciate that. So why Target? Target is on, you know, in every shopping mall. So everybody in the room here is familiar with Target. What are they doing right? What they're doing right and what they're not doing is kind of interesting, because the first thing a marketer would want to do is throw advertising at a market, at a community, in order to gain market share. But they took a very different approach. They wanted to make serious change within their business for their own employees as well as for their customers. And that's how they communicated that they deserve us to spend money at Target. So a couple examples. One is, you may go to some big department store and you go to the toy section. And at the top of the end cap, which is the front of the aisle, you'll probably see a sign that says boys toys, and another aisle that says girls toys, right? Target said, why are we doing that? Why don't we let these kids choose whatever toys they want to play with? We don't need to end cap that and point them into a segment. So they immediately removed that. They just said toys. That made a huge difference for the trans community as well as the overall LGBTQ community. That is walking the walk. Another thing that they did was they removed the gender designation for their changing rooms and for their bathrooms that are single stall. Why have a men's bathroom that's just one room for one person? Why is that a men's bathroom? So they took off the sign, and a single bathroom is for whoever wants to use it. So these are, you could say small changes, but they're really monumental changes in corporate America. And they created a ripple effect that I don't think will ever be matched. They're really hard to beat. They do very little actual advertising. You'll see, you know, during Pride season, they might have a whole section of, you know, t-shirts and mugs and everything like a lot of other companies. They have gift cards now with rainbow flags, and all that's great. But that won't put them in the #1 position. What put them in the #1 position is what they've done with and through and for the LGBTQ community.
And if I can add, sorry.
Go ahead, Dave.
I was going to say, you know, it's about reputation first, advertising second. It gets back to what I was saying earlier, is that you can't advertise first. It won't get you really anywhere. You needed to develop your reputation. Your reputation, you need a long approach. It could take years to really develop that reputation. And then you need to communicate that reputation to the LGBTQ community, but you got to develop it first. And the biggest mistake a corporation can do is just jump into advertising. It just doesn't work. And I also need to say with Tom is that we have had clients, I'm not saying it happens all the time, but when we get a new client or somebody looking at us to do research for them, the first thing we do is a reputation check. And at times we will discover that this new client has some reputation issues, and we'll go back to them and say, you need to fix your reputation issues first. We're happy to do research for you about your reputation and how to fix your reputation. But if you just want us to do like advertising testing, we won't do it for you because you're not ready. And we've had a couple of clients who say, no, we've really budgeted just for advertising testing, and we'll turn them away. It's like, no, we're not going to work with you because your reputation is not good enough to do advertising. So that's really important to say. And I think it's really something I say strongly, but we do that with our clients, is that without a good reputation, you're nothing in this community.
Rohini, you patiently had your hand up for a little while there. What would you like to ask?
Hi, Thomas. Hi, Dave. So I have a question regarding the panel selection, or choosing the members for any study that you do with LGBTQ community. Because like you said, there is so much discrimination, or if I may say so, stigma attached to it. So like how easy or difficult it is for people to come out and participate in such kind of studies?
It's a really good point.
That one?
Yeah, I think the best example of this, well, first of all, what is the LGBTQ community? From an advertising perspective, if you are out and you are not comfortable with your sexual orientation or gender identity, you're probably not answering surveys from me, right? You have to say that everyone in my panel is totally and completely out, but that is just a reality. And I think that's one of the reasons why our community tends to, in statistics, be better educated, because I think if you're better educated, you're more likely to be comfortable being out. And people who are less better educated, I think, are maybe more closeted and just don't show up in the research. So I just want to throw that out there a little bit. But I think generally in the United States, it's been a change over time. I think we've really been able to build this panel because people trust us. And they know we're just not going to sell their lists, and we have a really good reputation. But it is an issue, and I want to say that. Like a really good example is within HIV. Like one of the things that we really want to, a lot of pharmaceuticals really want is like to reach that young gay man who isn't out yet but might be experimenting sexually. Really hard, even for us to reach, right? Because they're not out enough to be answering research questions on a survey like this. So I don't know if that totally answered your question, but I want to acknowledge it is an issue, is that not everyone in the community is out, and not every community is going to be in a research group like ours. And that's an issue.
And let me just add that the way we get to the actual diversity that represents the LGBTQ community is through all these partnerships. In the beginning of the presentation, Dave showed 100 different, I mean, they were too small to read, obviously, but 100 different media organizations, influencers, events that partner with us. And when they send our survey out to their members and their readers and their attendees, that really does get the shotgun out there, and our community surveys then are able to represent the broad diversity that is the community. So I think it's also numbers and those partnerships.
And also say we don't do research of 100 people. I mean, I think the lowest we'll do a research project is on 1,200 LGBTQ people. So it helps build that diversity.
Okay. Well, we got lots of hands raised out here. Why don't you go ahead first? You may have to speak up.
Maybe we'll need the question repeated because we can't hear it.
Okay. You go ahead and then I'll repeat it. Sure.
And my question
Okay, excellent. So the question was very complimentary about the reports that you had shared with me, Tom, and I shared the links with the class. And one of the things that she's commenting on is that it's really interesting how you, we'll have multiple questions that really dive deeply into a topic. Or you'll have one question that identifies kind of a general takeaway, and then other questions or other ways of breaking that out that really kind of drills deeper. So one of the examples was, I'm sorry, what was it that was the 90%? Gotcha. So for example, 90% felt that they were proud of themselves and proud of the community, but only about half were saying they could really like fully be themselves. So, how do you do the kind of, questionnaire design, and how are you thinking in advance about what are the higher level issues and how do we drill deeper? What advice would you have around that?
Well, I'll throw it out. Dave will probably want to add to it, but we've been doing it trial and error for years and years and years. And so, for example, our question about identity, we used to ask a very limited list of how do you identify? And we've grown that list. You could see many, many different identities that we offer. And then at the bottom, we say, other, please describe so that we can grow the list. We also never say, choose one. That would be criminal for our community because many of us identify in many different ways, and we need to be open to that, and we need to understand it. So crafting a questionnaire is really about nuance. It's about terminology. We see a lot of surveys out there by what we would call mainstream research companies, and we just cringe because we know that if our panel saw that survey, they would just click out of it. And therefore, the LGBTQ side of it would be misrepresented and skewed. So a lot of it's trial and error. A lot of it is getting advice and talking to our panel. Dave does that, like he said, every day. They give feedback on our questions. They give small nuance saying, this question's a little bit off. It makes me a little uncomfortable. How about if we do it this way? We also have 100 partners that get to see the questionnaire. They give us their feedback. So before we go out there, we really do our own research, I could say.
And just want to add, any client is unfortunate. I mean, any client doesn't want to hear this, but the reality is we've been doing it for a long time. So if an auto industry client comes to us, that's great. I've probably done a couple auto industry clients before that, and I've seen the mistakes that I've made, and I can correct them for the next client. So we're always getting better with the next client when it's a new industry.
And next term, I'll be teaching qualitative research. And so often qualitative is a good entree to that kind of questionnaire design. So you can really talk to people, go deeply in things. You can hear their emotional responses. You can start to get a sense of where they might have conflicting feelings. They might have some ambivalence, and that helps inform that kind of.
100%, 100%. I love qualitative work. I learn so much. Usually it's Dave moderating the group and I'm sitting behind the glass. Now it's all virtual, of course, or at least for now, but I love it. I agree that just the facial expressions and then the spontaneous interaction between the participants and them asking each other questions. It makes me happy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please.
Yes, you said that a third of your clients were travel. I just wanted to know the international people to some Slavic countries in Eastern Europe or Arabic countries where people.
Were you able to hear that okay, guys?
No.
No.
Okay. maybe could you come up and stand on that, please? Yeah, okay. All right. Hey,
It's not working. You're gonna have to repeat it. I'm sorry.
Oh man, it's so hard with the mask. So
Okay.
I saw that a third of your country or clients were travel companies, right?
Right.
And I just want to know what kind of international data you collected, because I'm sure safety would be an issue for the LGBTQ plus community. You don't want to send people to some certain Arabic countries where safety could be an issue, or Eastern Europe where there's a lot of violence going on about the community.
Well, first of all, so we primarily do our work, which we really didn't talk about, is that we have a very strong panel in the United States and Canada, and we also have a very strong panel in China. And a lot of our work is actually in China and the LGBTQ community in China. So we don't actually do a lot of work of Europeans, but we do a lot of work for tourism offices in Europe trying to get North Americans to travel to Europe. So I don't know if that's exactly what we're talking about, but you're right. But I want to talk about the island thing, is that LGBTQ friendly is surprisingly local. And what I mean by that is that the community does not necessarily punish entire countries or entire states because of the larger level political. So what I mean by that is, like, Fort Lauderdale, Miami, and Key West are great LGBTQ destinations that we travel to in great numbers, but Florida's not so great. Austin's a great place, but Texas is not so great with our community, right? So we're willing to forgive the errors of the state and country sometimes if the local community is a little bit better. So internationally, even within some of the countries that you mentioned, sometimes the local community is actually stronger than you might think. And like in Eastern Europe, some of these major cities have pretty strong LGBTQ communities. A lot of LGBT people travel there. But I get what you're saying. Not all places in the world are safe. There's a lot of countries in the world where it's criminal to be LGBT. There's a lot of countries in the world where they kill you because you're LGBT. And obviously, those are not hot tourism destinations for our community.
I agree. Safety is the #1 concern and issue when we decide where we're going. So yeah, good for calling that out.
And also say that safety does not mean something different to our community. Generally, we do pretty good with like epidemics, and we do pretty good with petty crime and that kind of stuff. That doesn't freak us out. It's those large picture, like you're gonna beat us up or kill us because we're gay. That's what safety means for us.
Yes. Yeah, so given the pace of change in the world and the pandemic and all that kind of stuff, like how quickly are you refreshing data? When do you start to think of data as a little outdated and in need of an update?
Yeah, well, we do all the time. But interestingly, we're doing a travel survey now, which is we're actually following a group of, I think, about 1,500 community members and their travel habits every 6 months. And I think the most interesting thing with LGBTQ travel over the last year is that a whole group of destinations that we never considered to be friendly or we never traveled to opened up to our community. So our community, much like the rest of the world, became very local in our travel. We were traveling within an 8-hour car drive, and all sorts of places that we didn't necessarily travel to before became really hot. So I look in Southern California, where I'm at right now. Well, first of all, Joshua Tree became really, really hot with the LGBT community, but also there's this mountain town called Big Bear, just up the mountain from us. That became really hot in the LGBT community because people from LA had to go somewhere and they had to drive there. And all these people started influxing in these rural places. Well, that happened all over the country, where rural America and small destinations became hotter LGBTQ destinations over the last year, while the traditional cities like San Francisco and New York became less popular because they didn't want to or couldn't travel there. So that was a big change that happened and continues to happen.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yes. Yeah, okay, great question. So you showed data about members of the community feeling that California is a very friendly state to the community. And obviously you're based here, but 30 years ago when you started the company, it may not have been that way. And so what were some of the challenges and biases that you faced when starting the company?
I think it wasn't explicit when we started the company. It was more just not getting a response. So one of the first things that I did when I started the company, I have a passion for travel and I have a background in travel. So I thought, let's, as a first initiative, let's get some communication going between travel companies and the LGBTQ community. And I was living in San Francisco, so I rented a ballroom at the Palace Hotel. And so this was a bit risky, which is part of being an entrepreneur. So I rented this space and I had space for 30 or 40 tables. And then I went out to my contacts and I said, we're doing this travel trade expo. It's for the, back then we called it the gay and lesbian community. This is a really interesting new market for you. Would you like to be an exhibitor? Nothing. So many nothing responses. In fact, I got a few that said, I'm not gay, take me off your list. So not really clear on the concept either, that it wasn't for gay travel companies to reach the community, it was just travel. So I'm going to try and make this short, but it's really what started the company. Something happened on the way back from the first March on Washington, 1993. So break open your dusty history books and look at 1993, and you'll see that there was a gay and lesbian march on Washington for equality, for our rights, because back then it was a different world, or certainly a different USA. On the way back, flights were filled with gay and lesbian people. And on American Airlines, one flight attendant was overheard saying, after we land, get these pillows and blankets off the plane so the next passengers don't catch AIDS. So that was overheard and it went out into the news media, and the news media reacted and the community said, boycott American Airlines. They don't understand us. They don't get it. And American Airlines, in reality, that was one really unfortunate person, this flight attendant. American Airlines was probably one of the largest employers of LGBTQ people, because think about flight attendants, right? And they were then. And so they contacted us and they said, we heard you're doing a travel trade show. We would like to be an exhibitor and we'd like to be a sponsor. So wow, that was huge for me, which at the time, that was the company. And so then I went out to all the other people that I wrote letters to and I said, American Airlines is our keynote exhibitor at our Gay and Lesbian Travel Expo. Would you like to be an exhibitor? And they all opened up and we filled the place with travel trade and we filled the place with the community. And then we took the show on the road and did 14 different cities. So that really honestly started the company. It was one big mishap from a stupid person on a very good airline. And that was the big challenge, is really just being ignored back then. They just thought, hey, we don't want to talk about it. You know, we don't do that kind of thing. We don't support that. That's the kind of attitude I got. But we've overcome that.
And then one thing I would also add to that, Tom, is that while gays and lesbians became acceptable to corporate America, they really struggled with the transgender and non-binary community and really wanted to ignore the community. And it's only been in the last couple of years that they've realized that they can't outreach and be successful in our community unless they have programs for transgender and non-binary people, because we won't allow them anymore. They can't ignore the community anymore. So, so that's the big change that's happening today, is that there's a lot of programs being developed specifically for gender expansive people.
I think that's a great place to end it. And boy, thank you again so much for the thoughtfulness and your time, and really, honestly, your inspiration and your willingness to talk to students. Really, really appreciate it. We could all
thank you.
Round of applause.
We appreciate all you do, Stephen. You're awesome, and thanks for bringing us into this conversation. Those students out there are really fortunate to be with you and to have you as their mentor and teacher. So good luck to all of you. Again, you know who we are and where to find us. Please don't be a stranger. Take care.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. Great. All right, everybody. You doing okay out there, Rahini?
Yes, Steve.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes. And